Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Policy Roundtable, exploring the nexus between gender, climate, security, and migration. My name is Ariella Blatter. I'm the President and CEO of Women in International Security. I'm delighted to have you join us today. A little bit about WISE. WISE is a non-governmental organization that promotes gender equality by helping women advance as leaders in the international peace and security sector. We're celebrating our 35th anniversary this year, and for these last 35 years, our global organization has supported professional growth opportunities for women, led gender and equality research projects and policy engagement initiatives, and nurtured a community of powerful security advocates, experts, leaders, and mentors. Our network now spans nearly 50 countries across 6 continents, with about 15,000 members who are committed to closing the gender equality gap worldwide. Today's event will focus on the intersection between gender, climate, security, and migration. And we'll pay particular attention to how diversity, equality, inclusiveness, and access advances our understanding of these complex and interrelated topics. Our discussion will shed light on the complex and crucial role gender plays in climate, conflict, migration nexus, and explore sustainable solutions. And I want to recognize, as always, our wonderful partner for this event, the Embassy of Liechtenstein in Washington, D.C. I am grateful to His Excellency Georg Sparber, Ambassador of Liechtenstein to the United States, for his strong and enduring support of the gender, peace, and security agenda and WISE as an organization, and I welcome him to our roundtable today. I would also like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Maxine Ray-Layton, President of WISE New York, and also our esteemed 3 panelists, Dr. Marisa Ensor, Senior Fellow for the Institute of Study of International Migration at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, Mary Ruth Belsey, Non-Resident Women, Peace and Security Fellow at the Pacific Forum, and Ilhan Dahir, Research Associate Protecting Civilians at the Conflict Program at the Stimson Center. And I am delighted now to welcome and introduce Mr. Georg Sparber, Ambassador of the Principality of Liechtenstein to the United States. Prior to being appointed to Ambassador to the United States in 2021, Mr. Sparber held the position of Deputy Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations. And his portfolio included, among others, disarmament, peace and security, and political issues. I turn it over to you, Mr. Ambassador, and look forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much to WISE for again joining forces to highlight a topic of high importance in the area of gender and security. And thank you in particular to you, Ariella, and also to Karin for bringing together an incredible panel of speakers today to discuss the gender dimension of climate change and its impact on security and migration. Not so long ago, we probably would have had to begin by arguing that there is a gender dimension to this. Thankfully, for the most part, that page has been turned, and we owe a lot to the consistent efforts of civil society and academia in that regard. So today, we can actually focus on a deeper and integrated analysis of this question. But before that, let me maybe just highlight one issue that I believe is at the very heart of the issue, and that is, no matter the drivers of vulnerability, or no matter the circumstances aggravating people's livelihoods, and no matter the particular gendered impact of macro developments on individuals, the key to addressing and overcoming them is empowerment. It is the recognition of agency and autonomy, of providing the means for meaningful choice and inclusive decision-making. This holds true as much for humanitarian emergency settings, so often now created by the adverse effects of climate change, as it holds true for slow onset changes in livelihoods of people that lead to depopulation and mass displacement. By now, climate change is widely recognized as a contributing and exacerbating factor to migration and conflict, and women are, of course, more vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change due to limited access to goods, services, resources, land ownership, and to economic opportunities in general. Environmental migration is a gendered process that can further deepen pre-existing gender divides and weaken the capacity of women and girls to cope with the effects of climate degradation. For Liechtenstein, strengthening the agency of people, in particular of women and girls, must be the primary objective. And there is always also a financial component to this. Migration exposes women in particular to new risks and vulnerabilities. Displaced women and children face high risk of gender-related sexual violence, trafficking, discrimination, and exploitation. Oftentimes, financial need and dependency are at the root of such vulnerabilities. Therefore, we strongly advocate for financial inclusion as a means to increase autonomy and to reduce vulnerability. We believe in the enormous potential of financial inclusion for the prevention of abuse and exploitation. And we have made positive experiences in this regard with Liechtenstein's Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, or FAST in short. The major changes to our planet that our and subsequent generations face call for a broader and more systematic rollout of such successful strategies. But for that, we need the cooperation and buy-in from the private sector, who will play a crucial role in our efforts to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We're only at the beginning to tap this potential. And at the same time, we need a better understanding of the intersectionality of gender, climate security, and migration by bringing together, as we're doing today, experts from different fields to have a discussion that addresses the problem in all the diversity and inclusiveness needed. Most importantly, there must be room for women to meaningfully contribute to effective and sustainable policy solutions at the decision-making levels. This pertains as much to the politico-military dimension of security as it does to its economic and social dimensions. I'm confident today that today will be a substantive contribution to this discussion. And once again, I really look forward to listening to the panelists, who I really thank for sharing their views with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Mr. Ambassador. I just wanted to acknowledge that it takes a village, and that I would like to give my thanks to Dr. Karen Johnston and Roxana Verhami, as well as the entire WISE team, for helping to bring together this wonderful discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Maxine Ray-Layton. As I mentioned at the top of the conversation, Dr. Layton is the president of WISE New York, and additionally, she's a senior level strategist in communications, business development, and marketing for Jaros, Baum, and Bowles. Interestingly, over the last 20 years, Dr. Layton has held leadership roles in design firms, conducted pioneering research on the impact of climate change on design and planning professionals. And her work highlights how diversity, equity, and inclusion and access are critical to understanding climate change. So you can see why it was so important for her to chair this event today. She is regularly drawn upon by the United Nations and speaks also as keynote at the American Institute of Architects in New York. And so, Maxine, I turn over the floor to you to begin our conversation with our esteemed panelists.
Thank you. And Ariella, thank you for your ongoing and insightful leadership of WISE and for bringing us all together today. So I am very excited to tell you a little bit about the esteemed panelists that will be addressing us today. And with their intellect, their knowledge, and with a great deal of depth and compassion, they have addressed their work in this field. And I just want to say thank you in advance for all of that. So let me begin with Marissa O. Ensor, PhD, LLM. Marissa is a gender and youth specialist currently based at Georgetown University's Justice and Peace Studies Program and Institute for the Study of International Migration, School of Foreign Service. She is trained as an environmental anthropology and human rights law. And Dr. Ensor has a 15+ year of scholarship and practice in conflict-affected and environmentally fragile countries in Africa, Europe, and the MENA region in Latin America. Much of Marissa's work examines women and girls' positive roles in conflict prevention, peace building, human mobility, disaster risk management, environmental governance, which also includes climate action focusing on the identification of context-specific solutions. Now, prior to her joining Georgetown, she taught at several other universities in the US and abroad, including the American University in Cairo Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. And her research, which is quite extensive, has resulted in numerous publications, including 5 books, over 50 book chapters and journal articles, and dozens of technical and policy briefs. Welcome, Marissa. Now I'd like to introduce us all to our other speaker, who, using data analysis and feminine foreign policy perspective and theories, Mary Ruth Belsey research has focused on the nexus of gender, climate change, and peace and security in the Asia Pacific. She's completing a Harvard graduate degree in international relations and is currently a non-resident Women, Peace and Security, WPS, fellow at Pacific Forum. Mary Ruth was also selected as a 21-22 member of Harvard's Climate Leaders Program for professional students and is a member of the research network on WPS. She's published on issues of climate change, sustainability, gender equality, and WPS, including some of the following pieces: compound gender climate security, threats and vulnerability within the Indo-Pacific, and she has also written on the catalyst for women, peace and security in Qatar, COVID-19's impact on American women's food insecurity, foreshadowing the vulnerability in climate change. And the list goes on. So now I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Ilan Dahir, who is a research associate with the Protecting Civilians in Conflict programs, where she leads research on peace and security partnerships between the United Nations and regional organizations, and is a lead coordinator for the Atrocity Prevention Study Group. Her current research focuses on issues related to human rights, women, peace and security, UN peace operations, and civilian protection. Ilan previously worked at the African Union Mission to the United Nations as a consultant researcher, where she focused on issues concerning WPS, AU-UN partnership, climate security, and conflict-related displacement. Ilhan also worked at the International Peace Institute as part of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations team. She holds 2 master's degrees from the University of Oxford, where she studied global governance and diplomacy and refugee and forced migration studies as a Rhodes Scholar, and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and English from the Ohio State University, where she studied as a Morrell Scholar. So with that, I am going to give the floor to Marissa Ensor.
Right, well, good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to be in conversation with my fellow panelists and with all of you in the audience. All right, 10 minutes, much to say. As the ambassador has already noted, climate change is widely recognized as one of the greatest threats to peace and security in the 21st century. The causal pathways that link deteriorating environmental conditions, insecurity, and conflict are seldom automatic or linear, but they're nevertheless ubiquitous. The adverse effects of climate change exacerbate other risk factors, especially in already fragile contexts. In turn, these factors magnify pre-existing social, economic, or political drivers of insecurity and displacement. Women and girls, especially those who are also members of marginalized minority groups, are disproportionately impacted. At the same time, coping capacities and sources of resilience are also highly gendered. This nexus of gender, climate, security, and human mobility is complex and multifaceted. I've been working in this field for my entire 15+ year career, and today I'm going to focus my remarks on 3 main points. First, I'd like to briefly address why gender is so critical to understanding the linkages between climate change, security, and migration. My second point refers to what I call the violence of inequality. And my third one addresses human mobility in the context of environmental and political fragility. All right, so the intersection of gender and other dimensions of identity plays a critical role in determining how people experience and respond to and recover from the adverse effects of climate change, the impacts of conflict, the likelihood that they will engage in various forms of human mobility, as well as the consequences of the combination of these multiple factors. In contexts where the gender division of labor is rigid, the knowledge that each individual has will likely be heavily influenced by the tasks that she or he performs on a daily basis. The distribution of workload can also be influenced by factors like age or human capital, or by circumstances such as migration. Understanding who performs what tasks and under what conditions is important for appropriate targeting of interventions and information. Gender experiences of climate stress and violent conflict often manifest in women and girls enduring more limited access to resources such as food and water and basic services such as education and healthcare. Yet, it is imperative to transcend limited approaches that focus on short-term coping mechanisms as a shorthand for resilience, and identify power-sensitive frameworks that address the long-term root causes of vulnerability. The mainstream adoption of the resiliency concept, especially in policy implementations, as something intrinsically good, conceals power structures, inequalities, and gender vulnerabilities within societies. It does so by mainly focusing on the ability to cope and recover at individual, local, or national levels, instead of aiming to fundamentally change societies for long-term transformation. This understanding of resiliency is thus inadequate for elucidating the intersecting vulnerabilities that women and girls experience in the conflict climate nexus. These gender differentiated vulnerabilities often stem from or are exacerbated by inequalities within local power structures and embedded in social cultural norms and practices. It follows that women and girls experience crisis situations a way that is not just the result of exogenous shocks and stressors, but need to be understood in terms of structural power relations, which are reproduced in policy responses and in social norms sometimes. Women's experiences and the labor they perform are often undervalued, uncounted, and unpaid. When a significant portion of the survival strategies of households and communities relies on the invisible social reproductive labor performed predominantly by women, it can lead to a feminization of survival. The expectation that women will continue to carry out the bulk of unpaid domestic tasks while engaged in paid labor creates a double burden of work for women. This then becomes a triple burden or even quadruple burden when active participation in climate action, environmental governance, or peace building efforts are added to women's plates. If resilience and recovery policy fail to acknowledge this feminization of survival and feminization of burden, they inadvertently condone and contribute to perpetuating an unequal and unjust gender division of labor. A gender perspective can unveil these unintended consequences. Recognizing social reproductive labor as crucial for survival would broaden our understanding of what kind of support is required in order to efficiently and equitably strengthen resilience. Now, with respect to the violence of inequality, extreme weather events have a greater impact on the poor and other vulnerable segments of the population, and even more so on those living in nations driven by conflict. Competition over resources, such as water and land, poses a serious geopolitical risk that can lead to armed conflicts whose disproportionate impact on women and girls is well documented. This heightened vulnerability is, to be sure, not inherent. Rather, it is structural and contextual, the result of gender inequalities in the political, social, and economic spheres as they intersect with other axes of social disadvantage, such as race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability status. Persistent social norms of female subordination cause women and girls to be more exposed to gender-based violence, and girls to be less likely than boys to continue their education during and after both conflict and climate-related events. Economic inequalities are also prevalent with women in developing countries, more likely to work in the informal sector. The commonly held global prerequisite of land tenure to participate in community natural resource decision-making also constrains women's input, with 64% of women lacking equal land rights to men in practice. Limited access to financial resources, training, and technology, and exclusion from political decision-making spheres at all levels are also common. Unequal power relations within families and communities further limit women's opportunities to participate in local environmental governance. A gender-blind approach that ignores diversity and inclusion thus weakens climate change adaptation and mitigation responses and reduces the efficacy of climate policy. It also contributes to the further marginalization and harmful effects on women, girls, and other excluded groups, and may even lead to the resurgence of conflict. Now, turning to human mobility, the many causes of displacement make for complex dynamics that frequently overlap. Complex emergencies resulting from the convergence of climate disasters and mass violence can drive displacement in a number of ways. When severe climate conditions strike regions already experiencing civil unrest, the combined pressures on the population can both intensify violence and lead to greater displacement. This kind of cycle between displacement and violence can be self-perpetuating. An additional topic that is receiving growing attention but remains insufficiently understood is the role of human mobility as a climate adaptive strategy. Human mobility in the context of climate change may involve migration, displacement, and planned relocation, both internally and cross-border. In this context, the temporal dimension of climate-related human mobility requires far more attention than it has received to date, as is the link between short-term coping mechanisms and longer-term adaptation or maladaptation strategies. There's a growing body of evidence indicating that unsustainable displacement as a coping mechanism may lead to longer-term maladaptation, including tensions between local and displaced populations, contributing to political instability and even conflict. This thematic area is a current priority for scholars and policymakers, as illustrated, for instance, by the work of the Global Commission on Adaptation. Environmental migration, like other types of migration, is a gender process. Migrants of all genders have different needs and priorities and are exposed to various risks along their ways. Climate change disproportionately burdens women who have different access to information, resources, and employment opportunities in destination communities and countries. As climate change destroys existing livelihoods, women are more exposed to the risk of being left behind and trapped in dangerous environments, while also expected to take care of family and household responsibilities when men migrate to seek better livelihood opportunities. In addition, behavioral restrictions can hinder women's ability to move without the consent of a male figure. Therefore, women's options to adapt to environmental disasters, as well as conflict, are strongly dependent on social cultural gender norms. When women are pressured to migrate in order to sustain a healthy and safe living elsewhere, they often face specific risks during their migration routes. These may include abuse, discrimination, exploitation, gender-based violence, and trafficking in persons, and face challenges in accessing sanitation and sexual and reproductive and mental health services. Okay. Running out of time. So to conclude, as climate change intensifies and extreme weather events wreak havoc on communities, human populations are becoming increasingly mobile. According to some estimates, events linked to climate change, including extreme droughts and desertification, wildfires, severe flooding, sea level rise, agricultural losses, food and water insecurity, are expected to forcibly displace between 50 and 200 million people worldwide by 2050. Displaced women and girls require tailored support and protection to ensure their safety and ability to exercise their rights. Better data and analysis can help to improve policies and programs aimed at providing displaced females with the right resources to meet their specific needs. Gender disaggregated data and analysis and target policies and programs backed by sufficient funds are needed to better address the impacts of conflict, environmental crisis, and displacement on women's and girls' lives. All right, I think I'm completely out of time, so I'll conclude there and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa, so much for that really in-depth and very powerful presentation. So now I have the pleasure to giving the floor to Mary Ruth.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. I am really pleased to be here and honored to be speaking alongside these very accomplished women on the subject of gender, climate security, and migration, specifically in the Asia Pacific. Today, I'm going to frame my remarks around three linkages, and you're going to see probably a lot of repeating themes with Dr. Ensor. So first, I'm going to look at how is climate change likely to intensify existing gender inequalities and what are the resulting impacts on human security. Second, how may climate breakdown transform gender norms and will such changes impact human security? And then third, how might the first two linkages contribute to the greater likelihood of violence and conflict? First, how might climate breakdown intensify gender inequalities, including gendered access, agency, and vulnerability? Gendered access restrictions impact what resources women may have when deciding whether to adapt in place or migrate. And at both community and household levels, gender norms frequently bar women from accessing resources, including such things as education, healthcare, public transportation, banking and financial services, and property ownership, all which may severely limit women's migration options when she goes to choose what to do. Women who do own or control assets are likely to sell their assets sooner than men, which increases their poverty over successive disasters and may accelerate decisions to migrate if that's her choice. Looking at agency, though women's domain is typically in the home, they may have little to no agency in personal or family migration decisions or adaptation decisions. And at the macro level, women are often excluded from community decision-making regarding climate-induced relocation decisions. For instance, in Vanuatu, women were barred from participation in village decisions regarding the nature and timing of forced relocation of their entire village. Dr. Ensor already talked about many vulnerabilities that drive migration. I will highlight two here that, again, you're going to hear some similar themes. First, women's existing unpaid care and domestic work, often referred to as the care economy work or social reproductive work, will likely increase due to climate change and then increase again due to migration. And then bodily depletion, the depletions of women's bodies is often the result, intensifying women's vulnerability. Second, due to the subordinate nature and role of women, governments often make minimal investments to care economy infrastructure like housing, public transport, water and electricity systems, schools, and medical facilities. At baseline, lack of good care infrastructure contributes to women's drudgery and bodily depletion. And then as climate breakdown damages care infrastructure further, women's unpaid care burdens are likely to further increase, potentially necessitating migration earlier. For example, Cyclone Amphan hit India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka in May 2020, destroying 2 million poorly constructed homes. Homes are often the locus of women's lives, including their economic and personal lives, and when damaged, frequently trigger migration as a result, as they did in this case. In addition to the climate migration drivers, migration, the journey in and of itself may increase gender vulnerability. Again, there are many aspects to this, but I'll just highlight two. First, both women and men migrants may become unwittingly involved in varying types of criminal behavior as, now I've lost my part, may become unwittingly involved in varying types of criminal behavior or human trafficking. For instance, in the Asia Pacific's maritime environment, it's sensitive to climate-caused floods and extreme weather, and increases in illegal fishing, drug and arms smuggling, and human trafficking have already been recorded and especially involve migrant men. Second, men may become frustrated as if they cannot achieve socioeconomic mobility through employment in their new locations after migrating, which it decreases their mental health and then human security. The second linkage suggests that climate change may interact with gender norms to transform them. One main transformation is household feminization, which occurs when women take on heads of household roles for the first time. Household feminization may be positive and negative and is mediated by factors such as marriage, land and property ownership, divorce and child custody laws, and kinship systems, resulting in very significant variation between countries. Regardless, negatively, when women become household heads, their vulnerability may intensify due to increased poverty, more unpaid care work, higher physical burdens, lower health outcomes, decreased mental health, and lower rates of literacy. When it comes to access, women-headed households may face new challenges following migration. They are often refused aid, public services, or access to legal and police systems without a male household head. Nevertheless, household feminization may increase a woman's agency. For instance, a woman may prefer to be without a male partner, or new employment may offer greater household bargaining power. She may enjoy freedom from emotional and physical abuse and mental health challenges. She may have increased autonomy over her finances, time, and care responsibilities, and household feminization may also improve girls' educational attainment levels. Notably, another transformation of norms is the reconstruction of masculinities, which may occur when displaced men lack employment and must look for new ways of finding. For example, many men were displaced following the building of a dam in India and Malaysia due to a loss of land and work. The resulting reconfiguration of masculinities was destabilizing for many men. Finally, greater human insecurity caused by linkages 1 and 2 may increase rates of fragility, tensions, and violence within a community. For example, migration may take men into a region with limited access to jobs. This may frustrate men if they cannot fulfill their culturally defined masculine roles, in which case their susceptibility to recruitment into rebel and armed groups as a means of obtaining income and regaining status may increase. Host states may respond to climate migration using hyper-masculine language like migrant threat and securitizing borders. This type of language casts humans as a menace to local communities. In the Pacific, for example, resettlement of migrants on others' customary land has contributed to conflict and governance issues. Furthermore, if hypermasculine responses result in denial of legal employment and residency, these populations may turn to behaviors criminalized by the state, such as working without a visa, effectively transforming them into punishable criminals. The criminalization of migrants significantly increases their vulnerability and can destabilize communities, a factor that may impact women and men differently depending on the context. Interestingly, tensions between groups such as migrants and host communities may be another pathway by which gender norms are transformed. In communities where out-migration of men is common, women may exercise greater leadership in conflict to maintain access to their land and resources, sometimes violently, as has been the case in some Nepalese communities. So as we've seen, women and men will face both challenges and opportunities due to climate migration. Crucially, the time immediately following a climate shock, such as climate disaster or migration, often represents a period of temporary relaxation of social constraints, such as gender norms. So while climate migration may be a crisis, such crises may also present opportunities to engage in gender norm transformation. For instance, when migrant women are resourced, they tend to take active roles in supporting one another. Women have formed collectives to pool funds for communal projects and to support vulnerable members. Also, studies have shown that one of the most gender transformative ways to redistribute care work is through the development of better designed infrastructure. Labor-saving infrastructure can be designed for migrant communities to reduce time demands and drudgery of care work, freeing women to focus on things that improve their resilience. Additionally, though women are frequently excluded from disaster risk reduction planning and implementation, when included, disaster responses, such as those related to climate migration, are more likely to include gendered risks. More importantly, women can be active agents of change in migration adaptation activities, and women's leadership may spawn new opportunities for greater agency for women in the home, social life, and political life. So looking at these three: gender, climate security, and migration linkages may help us to better prevent and prepare for climate migration, including in the Asia Pacific, which stands out as being more exposed to physical climate risk than many parts of the world. And the region is also beset by gender inequality. To wrap up, I'll share just two Asia Pacific countries' high-level risks at this nexus. You can see here that both Bangladesh and Fiji struggle with fragility, climate risk, and gender inequality. And though Fiji's overall risk is lower, they are both ill-prepared for future climate migration risks. The Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan of 2009 has been under-resourced, and many policies have not been implemented. In particular, they've identified better monitoring of migration as a need, though little work has been done to realize this goal. Fiji's 2017 National Adaptation Plan framework calls for aerial mapping of sea level rise and storm surge to better plan migration, but these two are not yet available. That concludes my remarks. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Mary Ruth, thank you. Creating and really expanding the bridge here in terms of the cultural aspects and the impacts on the psyche and inequality is a very, very important part of this conversation. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront for us. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Ilhan, and we're looking forward to your insights and your wisdom.
Thank you very much. And I would also like to start by thanking the organizers of this timely and urgent conversation, particularly Women in International Security and the Embassy of Liechtenstein for bringing all of these minds together today. And thank you very much to the other panelists. I really got lost in your remarks. I almost forgot that I had to deliver my own. So for my own remarks, I will try to be as concise as possible while also having a bird's eye view of the problem. So beginning at the highest level of conceptualization, if we were to ask, as we have been doing this afternoon, why does gender and inclusion matter in this conversation? The simplest answer, I think, is probably the most correct, and that is because no discussion regarding the movement of people, let alone forced migration of populations due to climate, conflict, or calamity would be entirely complete without it. So my remarks will be based on that beginning thought, but also taking a lot of inspiration from many of the great scholarship that already exists about the African continent in particular, and the work that needs to be done there in order to magnify the voices of women leaders in that space. I'll discuss the impact that climate change has had on forced migration and the pressing need to center gender responsiveness in an effort to understand the phenomenon and hopefully in some small way to begin mitigating its related harms. To begin, a majority of the global population of internally displaced people are women and girls. Not only are women and girls vulnerable to displacement, data and research shows without a shadow of a doubt that they're also incredibly vulnerable within displacement. The dimensions through which we see the gender, climate, and forced migration nexus, including the three areas of focus from today's remarks and from my own: resilience and vulnerability, access and resources, and agency and decision-making, are themselves deeply interconnected. The gendered vulnerabilities inherent in climate-related forced migration contribute to a lack of access to the necessary resources to mitigate them. This reality leads to a sort of closed loop of victimization for those most susceptible to gender-based violence. In terms of resilience and vulnerability, this often takes the form of both domestic and more systemic gender-based violence. The violence of inequality has been studied by many and has also been brought up in our discussion earlier, including researchers from IUCN that found that discrimination and inequality drive gender-based violence, which in turn increases inequality. The issues of gendered inequality and climate-related displacement are not only in conversation with one another based on this research, but indeed we find over and over again that they are inextricably linked. So all of this to say, the increase in risk due to climate change magnifies the gender-specific impacts of climate-induced shock. Existing and projected decline in natural resources, particularly in Africa, that many women rely on as a source of livelihood for themselves and their families. This includes fresh water, soil fertility, harvest. This all presents a serious risk for women in the long term. The degradation of these resources leads to the migration of men to cities and other regions where they can find alternative economic opportunities, while women are left in the spaces most directly impacted by climate change-related resource depletion. This results in additional labor responsibilities for the women and increased vulnerability. This was the case in Mali, where women lack the same rights of men concerning commodity acquisition and fiscal resources. And very importantly, these resources include fungible resources, which leads to long-term impacts. This vulnerability is itself socially constructed and must be seen as an issue to address in all interventions and climate change mitigation schemes. Some researchers argue that women's exposure and vulnerability to natural disasters are socially constructed through gender. Where women have access to limited information, health, and food resources, they are also granted less decision-making power. So this directly also affects agency and decision-making in the long run. These socially constructed gender inequalities have also been linked to higher disaster mortality rates for women and girls in comparison to boys and men. In terms of access, violence in these instances becomes a sort of means of control. This is an access issue that has a major impact on where and how women can work, provide for themselves, and survive in tremendously difficult situations. In this way, violence and vulnerability take several forms, including human trafficking and other gender-based violence. We know that climate change-related natural disasters lead to displacement, and that increases instances of human trafficking. The UN Environment Programme has noted as much as a 20 to 30% increase in trafficking after natural disasters, and Interpol warns of women's increased exposure to trafficking following these disasters. Furthermore, the exact proportion of forced migrants experiencing sexual and gender-based violence is unknown, but thought to exceed 50%. Increasingly, these protracted conflicts deepen issues. Women and girls are distended in a violent limbo, a liminal space that worsens existing gender problems. Economic inequality is a key dimension of this conversation as well, and I believe a potential for future conversations regarding how we can begin solving this issue. Both global inequality between nations and intracommunal inequality with gendered implications. For instance, in Somalia is currently experiencing one of the worst drought crises in 40 years. And while at the same time, Pakistan is dealing with one of the most destructive flooding seasons on record. Both are examples of unequal impact of climate change, where poorer countries contributing very little to global emissions suffer the most. Across the African continent, this is also the case, since Africa contributes the least as a continent to global warming. However, it remains a continent that is the most vulnerable to grave consequences of climate change. In Somalia, the country is facing protracted and recurring humanitarian crises, coupled with the threat of flooding and a COVID-19 pandemic that continues to wreak havoc on the public health sector. Early indications of the October to December forecast point to yet another below average rainfall season. This climate insecurity has led to an erosion of coping mechanisms, and women and girls who are most at risk of violence in this context are resorting to negative coping mechanisms. While humanitarian organizations are contributing to life-saving efforts, humanitarian assistance alone cannot provide sustainable or cost-effective solutions in the long run to recurring climate shocks, not only in Somalia, but in other contexts as well. This is the case in many regions, including the Sahel, where permeable borders, transnational migratory patterns, transhumanist pastoralism across national state lines, and transnational threats create a threat to the entire region and not just one country. In the face of these constant movements, the region has been experiencing a host of overlapping issues that have broad-reaching effects on countries in the region, but also an unduly heavy burden on the women in those countries. Climate-related impact and migration require substantial development and climate change mitigation investment, while strengthening the nexus between the humanitarian and the developmental assistance aspects. This will help us in achieving medium to long-term solutions to these problems ailing countries across the globe, and gets many of these countries closer to achieving the sustainable development goals and target the most vulnerable citizen in all of these spaces. I realize I'm running low on time, so I will get to the agency and decision-making aspect now. I think this is something that's come up in the remarks today, but it is certainly something that comes up in the data and the research. Time, or the conceptualization of time, is the silent but ever-present barrier to women's meaningful engagement in decision-making structures. Efforts to implement statewide women's organizations or women's centers, efforts to increase participation of women in political structures, all face incredible difficulty because women simply cannot show up in the conditions that they are currently in. They can't come to engage in these movements and inform the development of policies since they spend the majority of their time in their natural resources role, fetching and traveling for water, for instance. Conflict disrupts people's access to key natural resources, fresh water, fertile land, fields to graze. Displacement leads to impermanence and makes it difficult to engage. All of these conditions have major implication for women's participation in establishing new government structures or taking place in social organizing. Furthermore, as climate change impacts worsen, women are investing more and more time into their daily duties. Due to droughts, women are forced to travel longer distances to collect water. They are forced to take more precautions against future flooding or drought. And all of this erodes at their time. However, this issue is not only a technical issue about how much time there is in a day, it's also one that reaches beyond the amount of time a woman has and is linked to social and cultural norms that place women in positions of lesser decision-making power to begin with, which leads to a lack of precedent for political engagement and limited rights. Coupled with this very real-time constraints present in displaced women's lives, there is less opportunity to diversify livelihood options and enhance well-being in the absence of a male household head, especially if that male household head has migrated. While women have fewer resources as well as less ownership of financial assets, they can be and should be agents of change within their communities. We must find ways to work around the realities of the existing gender roles, adopting inclusive approaches, while also requiring responsiveness to the realities of quote unquote crowded time, increasing access to resources, amplifying voices, and reducing vulnerability. In terms of regional action, the African Union has taken steps this year that I think are really important to touch on. On the sidelines of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, African women leaders addressed this very topic and noted that it's incredibly important for women in Africa to look at the climate change issue not as an issue that's subsidiary to peace and security or to development and long-term success of African nations, but central to those questions. African countries adopted the Common Africa Position with a call to action both at the national, regional, and global level, which will continue to be important. We know that these topics interact in highly complex ways. We know that there is a part to play for countries, for regions, for continents, and for international shareholders such as ourselves. However, there's still a long way to go. I think a few of the places we can begin is with better gender disaggregated data regarding the impact of climate-related forced migration. This is incredibly crucial for us to begin designing a gender-responsive intervention that is rooted in reality. We also need to begin expanding our terminology and understandings. As was mentioned earlier by Dr. Ensor, our ideas of resiliency continue to be inadequate. We have to begin managing definitions and expanding them to include the lived reality of women at the center of these conversations. And we need to move towards a consensus on what gender responsive solutions mean in the context of climate change related displacement. Stakeholders must begin to work toward naming these different mechanisms of gendered vulnerability and developing solutions that address these vulnerabilities, but also leave a legacy for long-term positive development. And finally, and most importantly, we have to begin both the study, we must begin studying and addressing gender differentiated outcomes for what they are, but we must not forget that centering women as change makers and foremost experts on this issue is the beginning of any conversation of that sort. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for further expanding upon the conversation about trafficking and gender violence and creating that bridge about leadership, as well as you mentioned something about the aspect of time. And I think that that's a very important part of the discussion that doesn't happen very often. There's a wonderful scholar and planner, Robert Olshansky, who spoke a lot about the issues about climate change and the aspect of time and the impact and how we don't really take that into account. So thank you for bringing that up in a very in-depth and wonderful presentation. So now I would like to encourage all of our participants to please go into your Q&A and please ask questions. But in the meantime, I would like to kick this off with a couple of questions that have come to light for us. And I'd like to begin with the question of agency. This is something that one doesn't hear a lot about in these conversations, and it is a very powerful linchpin to what we're talking about. So I'd like to throw this out to all of our speakers today. In your experience, what strategies have helped build women's agency to counteract problems that are associated with climate change and its effects? And the second part of the question is, what seems to have the most promise in terms of agencies? Are there any specific regional examples you could point to? And who would like to start off in answering that question? Marissa?
I could perhaps offer a few preliminary comments. And that one thing that I've noticed is that in much of the literature and policy discussions, the concepts of agency, vulnerability, and resilience are frequently presented as if they were mutually exclusive. And I think that this is problematic. And there are plenty of examples throughout the world in which women may be vulnerable to the combined effects of climate change and political instability and security, in the sense that they are more prone to receive the negative effects of that nexus, and at the same time are resilient in the sense that they are leveraging their agency to get organized, to engage in meaningful action. And I would like to offer the example of the women of South Sudan, which is a country I've been working in for the last 15 years, basically my entire professional career, as an example of still limited but noteworthy success. Now, when the experiences of women in South Sudan is discussed, the topic that is more frequently mentioned is that of sexual and gender-based violence, how extremely prevalent and how rural it is, both during and before and after there are multiple waves of conflict. And that while this is indeed the case, the prevalence of SGBV in South Sudan is staggering. My interactions with women in South Sudan, as well as with refugee women in neighboring countries, is that while they acknowledge this as part of their lived reality, they are not defined by it. Okay? So South Sudanese women, including or perhaps especially survivors of war-related and more structural sexual and gender-based violence, they're overcoming the physical and psychological trauma they endure through counseling, mutual support, and participating in various livelihood schemes. In recent years, South Sudanese women have made significant strides in their push for inclusion in natural peace processes. Despite cultural restrictions and risking harassment by South Sudanese security forces, these women have registered significant success, and I think that they need to be given credit for that. Women negotiators were crucial in shaping the 2018 peace agreement and in securing a new quota requiring 35% of government representatives to be women. Whether this quota is being achieved or not is a different matter. But this has opened the door for expanded roles of women in national affairs. Also noteworthy was the fact that a women's delegation met with UN Security Council members during their 1920 visit to Juba. They demanded the establishment of the hybrid court of South Sudan, which this is intended to bring perpetrators of war crimes, including those committed against women and girls, to justice. Chapter 5 of this agreement, of the revitalized peace agreement, requires the transitional government to establish this hybrid court, among other transitional justice mechanisms. And they succeeded. In January 2021, the South Sudanese government finally approved the establishment of accountability mechanisms to address the country's conflict, including a war crimes court in partnership with the African Union. So, provided that concrete action is taken to implement these mechanisms, this could represent an important step in reducing impunity and bringing a measure of justice to South Sudanese victims and survivors. So I think that, this illustrates the point that I was making before. Vulnerability, resilience in agency can happen simultaneously. And I think it's important to avoid characterizing women as primarily victims, because even when they are indeed the target of a disproportionate range of negative impacts, they leverage their agency to work, to improve their resiliency, and they are not always given enough credit for it. So I just wanted to offer the South Sudanese example as an illustration of this principle.
That's really excellent. And I think it's a very, very important point about women not being thought of as victims, even though one looks at what the acts were and the perpetration of those acts, because it's a further sense of disempowerment. So I really appreciate, and it also has a direct correlation to one claiming their agency. So I really appreciate your response to that question. And it actually dovetails very well to a question from someone in our audience, which is for you, Ilan. And the question is that you had mentioned negative coping mechanisms. And our audience member asked if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, so the conditions currently in Somalia due to this particular climate change shock, the current drought existing, takes place in several ways. One of those for young women has been early marriage and childhood marriage, which is on the uptick because of the current drought. Another is that in two regions, in Seoul and Sanag, they found that young kids were eating 1 meal a day instead of 2, so they were already undernourished and are now eating less. So these impacts have a gendered component, certainly, but they're also affecting children particularly in a particularly harsh way.
Thank you. We are coming close to our hour, and I'd like to know, Mary Ruth, is there anything else you'd like to say in response to these questions before I turn it to Karen for closing remarks?
Maybe I would just offer a couple of other examples of negative coping mechanisms. I know that in some communities, women start to, like I've mentioned before, sell off their resources a lot sooner than men, but then they also do things like pull their kids out of school, or take themselves out of education or other learning opportunities, especially those that might be related to climate adaptation. That can be a negative coping mechanisms because of their time constraints and the finances of doing those things. So some of the very actions that would actually give them better coping and resilience are kind of reversed in their cases, and then that makes them more vulnerable.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your insightful and thoughtful presentations. And I appreciate now turning the floor over to Karen Johnson, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a few remarks, particularly of thanks to our speakers and to the audience for coming in and being part of this conversation. Again, what we've learned here is that in many parts of the world, climate change is worsening the conditions that threaten peace and security, and gender norms and power structures play a critical role in determining how women and men of different backgrounds are affected by environmental disasters and how to respond to them. And so we need to better understand these complex ties that bind gender, climate security, and migration. As we've seen, the complexities mean that often the discussion itself is too simplistically drawn, and the gender dimension often underplayed. So there's much we can do to examine these processes and bring gendered agency and decision-making to the fore. And we will have other events on gender and climate security, focusing on different dimensions of this nexus. And we look forward to seeing you then and to having another discussion about some of the complexities and the interests that we all share on trying to advance both gender equality, decision-making, and all of the principles of the WPS and 1325 that we're committed to. So thank you very, very much.
So thank you, everyone. I see that there was a question in the chat that we were not able to answer, but we will, audience member, we will get an answer to you prior to closing out this discussion. So we just, because of time, we'll be able to do it verbally, but we will answer it in the chat for you. So thank you for contributing there. And thank you, everyone, for sharing your time and your energy with us. And we're really looking forward, as Dr. Johnson has said, is continuing this conversation with you. Thank you.